LeBron James sees his old lunch lady still working at 82. His response will make you cry. It had been years since LeBron James had set foot in Akron, Ohio, his hometown, the place where it all began. The streets, the gyms, and the school halls were all places that had shaped him into the man and player the world knew today. His journey from a young boy with a dream to an international basketball icon had been long, but he never forgot where he came from. This trip wasn't about basketball. It wasn't about business or charity events. This time, LeBron was visiting his old high school, St. Vincent St. Mary, for a personal reason. He had just finished a round of charity events in the area, but there was something pulling him back to his roots, back to the place where it all started. As he walked through the front gates of St. Vincent St. Mary, LeBron felt a rush of memories flood his mind. The sound of sneakers squeaking on the gym floors, the competitive spirit of his teammates, and even the tough moments when it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He had grown up in this place, where every day had been an opportunity to dream bigger. LeBron walked into the school, greeted by a few familiar faces, teachers who had watched him grow, staff who remembered his teenage years. The nostalgia was almost overwhelming. But as he walked down the hallway, something caught his eye, something that made him pause in his tracks. Through the window of the cafeteria, he saw an elderly woman standing behind the serving counter, handing out lunch to the students. There was a sense of familiarity, but it took a second for LeBron to place it. It was Mrs. Parker, his old lunch lady. He blinked, stepping closer to the window. There she was, still smiling, still moving with the same warmth and kindness he remembered. But something about her now, her age, the way she was standing, struck him. Mrs. Parker, now 82 years old, was still working in the same cafeteria, still serving meals to students. The sight of her, with her hair now graying and her movements slower than they had been when he was a teenager, made LeBron's heart ache. He stood there for a moment, watching her interact with the students. They didn't know her the way he did. They didn't know that Mrs. Parker had been more than just the lunch lady who served food. She was a constant, a source of kindness during his high school days when things weren't always easy. LeBron remembered the days when he was just another kid, dealing with the pressure of expectations, of living up to the talent he had. Mrs. Parker had always been there, offering him a warm smile and a word of encouragement, no matter how busy or tired she was. She was the one who would always ask how his day was going, even if she had to serve dozens of kids at once. And no matter how bad things got, she would always tell him, "You're gonna make it, LeBron. Just keep your head up and keep working." Her words had stuck with him throughout the years, more than he realized. When he was struggling or facing adversity, he often thought back to those simple moments. Mrs. Parker had given him more than just food, she had given him something no one else could. LeBron stepped into the cafeteria, his mind racing with thoughts of Mrs. Parker and the impact she had had on his life. As he approached the serving counter, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. Seeing her again brought back memories of a time when he was just starting to dream big, but it also filled him with concern. Mrs. Parker had always been a strong, independent woman, but now, seeing her still working at her age, he couldn't ignore the thought that something wasn't right. She deserved so much more. "Mrs. Parker?" LeBron said, his voice filled with surprise and warmth. She looked up, and her face lit up with recognition. Her smile was just as warm as it had been all those years ago. Well, if it isn't LeBron James," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Look at you, all grown up and making a name for yourself. I knew you'd make it, honey." LeBron smiled, his chest tightening with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. "I never forgot about you, Mrs. Parker. You were always there for me when I needed it." Mrs. Parker chuckled softly, wiping her hands on her apron. "You were a good kid. Always had that fire in you. I'm proud of everything you've accomplished, LeBron. But you're a busy man now, aren't you?" LeBron nodded, but there was something about her tone that made him pause. Her voice, though filled with pride, also carried a hint of weariness, something he hadn't noticed before. "You're still here, working every day?" LeBron asked, his voice softening. I didn't expect that. Mrs. Parker shrugged, but her smile faded slightly. Oh, you know. I don't mind it. Keeps me busy, and I'm still able to help the kids. They need someone to look out for them, and I'm happy to be that person. Even if I'm getting on in years, I still feel like I have something to give. LeBron's heart ached as he took in her words. Mrs. Parker had always been there for him, supporting him with her kindness and belief. But now, she was still working hard at 82, and he couldn't help but wonder why. Why was she still doing this? Shouldn't she be enjoying her retirement after all these years of service? He couldn't shake the thought as he stood there, talking with Mrs. Parker. She had always been more than just a lunch lady to him. She had been a mentor, a source of light when things felt tough. But now, she was still working at her age, with little recognition for all the sacrifices she had made throughout her life. For the first time, LeBron felt an overwhelming need to do something, to give back to the woman who had given so much to him. As he said his goodbyes and walked out of the cafeteria, his mind was already working, already planning what he could do to repay the kindness Mrs. Parker had shown him throughout the years. LeBron spent the next few days thinking about Mrs. Parker, reflecting on the moments he'd shared with her during his time at St. Vincent St. Mary. He couldn't shake the image of her standing behind the cafeteria counter, serving lunch with a smile, despite her age. The thought of her still working at 82, giving so much of herself to a job that most people would have long retired from, troubled him. But it wasn't just her age, it was the memory of how much she had impacted his life during the hardest years of his youth. Back in high school, LeBron had been an incredibly talented basketball player, but he was also burdened with the weight of expectations. His mother, Gloria, worked tirelessly to provide for him, but their life was still a struggle. LeBron never wanted to be a burden, and sometimes the pressure to perform on the court, to be the best, weighed heavily on him. He'd often gone to school with a heavy heart, not knowing how to deal with the pressures and distractions that came with his growing fame. But Mrs. Parker had always been there for him, even when he didn't ask for help. She had a way of making everyone feel seen, of offering a little encouragement just when it was needed. LeBron remembered how, after a tough game or when the weight of life outside of basketball felt like it was too much, Mrs. Parker would pull him aside for a moment of reassurance. "You've got this, LeBron," she would say with a smile, handing him a tray of food. "You're gonna do great things, don't you forget that. Just keep your head up." Her words weren't profound or life-changing in a dramatic way, they were simple, but they were always exactly what he needed to hear. Mrs. Parker was never too busy to take a moment for him, to check in, to make sure he was okay. And that made all the difference. In the cafeteria, Mrs. Parker would move through the line with a quiet grace, always checking on the students who seemed down, always making sure they knew they were cared for. LeBron, amidst his daily struggles, had appreciated her warmth more than he could express at the time. She had been the one constant in a world that was changing rapidly. While coaches, teachers, and friends came and went, Mrs. Parker remained, her steady presence a small beacon of hope and positivity. Now, decades later, as he looked back on those days, LeBron realized just how much her kindness had shaped him. It wasn't just the food she served, it was the love, the encouragement, and the belief she had shown him. Mrs. Parker had helped him navigate the emotional and mental struggles that came with his rise to fame, even when she didn't realize the depth of the impact she had. His mind kept circling back to one thing: why was she still working? Why was she still serving food to students who didn't understand how important she had been in shaping the lives of people like him? He knew he had to do something, but it wasn't just a matter of offering money or sending a check. Mrs. Parker had never been the type to accept charity, and LeBron understood that. This was about more than just giving back, it was about honoring her, showing her that the love and care she'd given to so many over the years hadn't gone unnoticed. The next time LeBron visited the school, he found himself standing in the cafeteria again, watching as Mrs. Parker moved through the line, just as she had all those years ago. She was serving food with the same smile, the same soft-spoken encouragement, and LeBron could see that despite her age, she was still giving all of herself to her work. But this time, LeBron wasn't going to walk out of there without doing something about it. He couldn't let her continue working so hard, especially when he knew the sacrifices she had made throughout her life. The woman who had cared for him when he needed it the most deserved better. She deserved peace, and most of all, she deserved a chance to relax and enjoy the rewards of her years of hard work. LeBron waited until after the lunch rush had calmed down and then approached Mrs. Parker as she cleaned up her station. She looked up, surprised to see him standing there, but her smile immediately warmed the room. "LeBron. What a surprise. You're back again. How's everything going?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she spoke. "Everything's good, Mrs. Parker. Really good. But there's something I need to talk to you about," LeBron said, his voice serious now. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately." She raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but still smiling. "Oh, I'm just fine, LeBron. No need to worry about me." LeBron shook his head gently. "No, it's not that. It's just that I see you here, working every day, and I realize something, it's not right. You've done so much for everyone here, you've given so much of yourself, and now it's time for you to take care of you. You shouldn't be working here at 82. You deserve better." Mrs. Parker's face softened, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability appeared in her eyes. She stepped back, wiping away a small tear that threatened to fall. "I don't know what you mean, LeBron. I'm just doing my job, trying to stay busy. It keeps me going, and I've got to keep up with the kids. They need me." LeBron stepped closer, his eyes filled with warmth. "No, Mrs. Parker, it's not just about staying busy. It's about taking care of yourself. You've spent your whole life taking care of others. Now, I want to make sure you can take care of you." She shook her head again, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I appreciate that, LeBron, but I don't need anything. I'm fine. I've always been fine." LeBron smiled, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Let me help. You've done enough for this community. Let me show you how much you've meant to all of us. It's your turn." Mrs. Parker hesitated for a moment, her eyes welling up with emotion. "LeBron, I never expected anything in return. I've just been here, doing what I love. And that's why I'm doing this," LeBron said softly. "Because you deserve to relax. You deserve to enjoy the life you've worked so hard for. So let me help you." The next few days were a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions for LeBron. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Parker and the conversation they'd had. Her refusal to accept help, her insistence on continuing to work at her age, these things weighed heavily on his mind. LeBron had always been someone who knew how to act decisively, whether it was on the basketball court or in business, but this was different. He couldn't simply offer a check and be done with it. This wasn't just about giving her money, this was about giving her the life she deserved after all the years she'd spent giving to others. It bothered LeBron deeply that Mrs. Parker had been forced to keep working, year after year, without much of a choice. She had spent decades making meals for kids, showing up every day with kindness and patience, not asking for anything in return. And now, at 82, she was still standing behind that counter. It wasn't right, and LeBron was determined to change it. He called a meeting with his team the next morning. It wasn't the first time he'd used his platform to help someone, but this felt more personal, more urgent. He had a vision, but he needed a plan, one that would not only give Mrs. Parker the financial support she needed to retire, but also offer her the chance to rest, to enjoy the rewards of her hard work without feeling like she was being handed something. LeBron sat with his closest advisors, discussing everything from healthcare options to retirement plans. He wanted to make sure this wasn't just a one-time gesture. This had to be something sustainable, something that would lift the burden of decades of hard work from Mrs. Parker's shoulders. "We need to give her more than just money," LeBron said firmly as he leaned forward in his chair. "She's been a fixture in that school for years, and now we have the opportunity to make sure she has peace of mind for the rest of her life." His financial advisor, Michelle, nodded in agreement. "We can set up a retirement fund for her, something that ensures she'll be taken care of." Maybe a scholarship fund in her name could be part of it to honor her contributions to the community. Something that makes her legacy live on. LeBron smiled at the idea. I like that. But I also want to make sure she knows how much she meant to me, to everyone. This has to be about more than just money. It has to be about respect. Michelle and his team got to work, outlining a comprehensive plan to help Mrs. Parker. They researched healthcare options, long-term financial support, and ways to create a lasting legacy for her. LeBron was determined to make sure Mrs. Parker had everything she needed to live out her golden years in peace and comfort. While the team worked behind the scenes, LeBron reached out to someone else, his childhood friend and business partner, Maverick Carter. They had worked together for years to build LeBron's off-court empire, and Maverick knew how deeply LeBron felt about this situation. LeBron shared everything with Maverick: the plan, the conversations, his frustration, and his desire to make it right. Maverick, as always, was supportive, but he understood the emotional weight LeBron was carrying. "LeBron, you're doing the right thing," Maverick said over the phone. "Mrs. Parker was there for you when you needed it most. Now it's time for you to be there for her. You're not just doing this because of the past, you're doing this because she deserves it. She built a legacy in that cafeteria. Let's help her enjoy it." LeBron appreciated Maverick's words. They were exactly what he needed to hear. He knew what he had to do now, and the team was moving swiftly to put everything in place. He felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just a gesture, it was an opportunity to honor someone who had impacted his life and the lives of so many others. Mrs. Parker's dedication, her quiet strength, and her endless love for the students she served deserved to be recognized and celebrated in the most meaningful way. The next day, LeBron decided to go back to St. Vincent St. Mary High School. He knew it wasn't enough to just set up a plan for her without speaking to her directly again. He needed to see her, to explain his intentions, and to make sure she understood that this was more than just charity. It was a way for him to show his deep gratitude. He entered the cafeteria once more, and there she was, Mrs. Parker, as she always was, behind the counter, moving gracefully as she served lunch to the students. LeBron's heart swelled as he watched her. The years had taken their toll, but her smile still had the same warmth, and her presence still had the same quiet power it had all those years ago. He waited until the students had gone, and then he walked up to the counter, just as he had done so many times before. Mrs. Parker looked up, surprised to see him standing there again. "LeBron, you're back," she exclaimed, a smile spreading across her face. "I didn't expect to see you today. What can I do for you, honey?" LeBron smiled gently, but his eyes were filled with emotion. "Actually, Mrs. Parker, it's what I can do for you." She frowned slightly, looking puzzled. "What do you mean?" LeBron took a deep breath. "I know you've been working here for a long time, and I know how hard you've worked. You've given so much to this school and to the kids, including me. But I've been thinking a lot about you lately, and I realize it's time for you to take a step back. You've earned that right." Mrs. Parker was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "LeBron, I don't need anything. I'm fine. I like being here. The kids need me." LeBron shook his head gently. "No, Mrs. Parker. You've already given enough. Now it's time for you to enjoy the rest of your life without worrying about working. I've made sure that you'll be taken care of, financially, medically, everything. You won't have to worry about anything anymore." Mrs. Parker's eyes widened as she processed his words. "LeBron, you don't have to do that. I never asked for anything from you. I just wanted to help you and the other kids." "I know," LeBron said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you've already helped so many of us. It's my turn to help you. This is about giving you peace of mind and letting you enjoy everything you've worked for." Tears welled up in Mrs. Parker's eyes as she looked at LeBron. "I never imagined anything like this. I didn't expect this from anyone, especially not you." LeBron smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You deserve it, Mrs. Parker. More than anyone I know. You're the reason a lot of us made it this far. Now it's time for you to enjoy the rest of your life." The days following his heartfelt conversation with Mrs. Parker were filled with anticipation. LeBron had made a decision, one that would forever change the life of the woman who had, without ever asking, shaped so many of his memories. He could see the quiet disbelief in her eyes when he told her he wanted to take care of her, but he also knew that this was about more than just providing financial support. It was about showing her that her years of hard work and sacrifices had been seen and appreciated. And now, he had the power to give something back that was long overdue. LeBron had always been a man of action, and he wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. He knew how to make things happen, whether on the court or in the business world. But this was different. This wasn't a sponsorship deal, a business venture, or even a charitable cause. This was personal. This was for Mrs. Parker, the woman who had offered him a smile and a kind word when no one else did. His team had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing the retirement fund, securing the healthcare package, and setting up everything Mrs. Parker would need to live the next phase of her life without the worry of financial strain or the need to keep working. But LeBron knew that wasn't enough. He wanted to make the gesture even more meaningful, something that Mrs. Parker would truly appreciate. It wasn't just about sending her a check or offering financial security. LeBron wanted to ensure that she could feel respected, valued, and appreciated, not just as a lunch lady but as a person who had given so much to the world around her. He wasn't going to offer her a handout, he was offering her a chance to live the rest of her years in peace and comfort, enjoying what she had earned with decades of hard work. LeBron was also determined to make this public, not as a spectacle, but as a testament to what real community support looked like. His life had been shaped by the people who helped him along the way, and it was time for him to do the same for someone else. Mrs. Parker deserved more than to be forgotten or overlooked, she deserved to be celebrated. LeBron arranged for a special meeting, a surprise event for Mrs. Parker, but he didn't tell her exactly what it was. He knew she would never accept anything that felt like charity, so instead, he framed it as a celebration of her impact on the community. He gathered a group of people who had worked with Mrs. Parker over the years, from the school's administrators to local leaders and even former students who had been influenced by her kindness. It wasn't just a surprise for Mrs. Parker, it was a recognition of everything she had given, a way for the community to stand up and say, "Thank you." The day arrived. LeBron walked into the school's auditorium, which had been decorated for the occasion, but it wasn't the balloons or the decorations that mattered. It was the look on Mrs. Parker's face as she walked through the door, unsure of what was happening, but her curiosity piqued. "Mrs. Parker." LeBron greeted her warmly, his voice filled with excitement and pride. "I'm glad you could join us today." Mrs. Parker looked around, surprised to see so many familiar faces. "LeBron, what is all this?" she asked, clearly overwhelmed by the gathering. "I didn't expect this, not in a million years." LeBron smiled, gesturing to the audience. "This is for you. This is a celebration of everything you've done for this school, for this community, and especially for me. You've touched so many lives, Mrs. Parker, and it's time we all showed you how much we appreciate everything you've done." Mrs. Parker looked around the room, her eyes filling with tears as the faces of former students and colleagues all smiled at her, showing their love and appreciation. For the first time in years, Mrs. Parker was the center of attention, and it was clear that the love and respect she had given to others had come full circle. But LeBron wasn't done yet. He walked to the front of the room, where a large check was displayed on an easel. It wasn't just any check, it was the result of the plan he had set up for her. He had arranged a retirement fund that would provide her with everything she needed to live comfortably. He had also secured healthcare coverage, ensuring that she would never have to worry about medical expenses again. But most importantly, it was a recognition of her life's work. "Mrs. Parker," LeBron said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is for you. This is a retirement fund, one that will take care of you for the rest of your life. I want you to know that you've earned it, and I'm honored to be able to do this for you. You don't have to work another day in your life unless you want to. But you deserve the time to relax, to rest, and to enjoy everything you've given." Mrs. Parker's eyes widened as she saw the check. Her hands shook as she took it in, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. "LeBron, I don't know what to say," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I never expected anything like this. You've already done so much for me. I can't believe this is real." LeBron placed a hand on her shoulder, his heart full. "You've done more for me than anyone will ever know. You helped me when I needed it most, and now it's my turn to help you. You've earned this. You've earned everything." The room erupted into applause, and Mrs. Parker, overcome with emotion, stepped forward to embrace LeBron. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking with gratitude. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for giving me the chance to rest. I've spent my life giving to others, but I never thought someone would do this for me." LeBron smiled, his eyes glistening with pride. "You've given so much to so many, Mrs. Parker. It's an honor to be able to give something back to you." As the applause continued, LeBron stepped back, watching as Mrs. Parker stood before the crowd, overwhelmed but filled with a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in years, she was truly being celebrated, and she was able to accept the recognition with the dignity and grace that had always defined her. The days after the celebration were filled with an overwhelming sense of peace for both LeBron and Mrs. Parker. For Mrs. Parker, it was as if the weight of decades of hard work had been lifted from her shoulders. She had never imagined that, in her later years, she would receive such a profound acknowledgement for her lifetime of dedication. She had spent her entire career giving to others, and now, at 82, she was finally able to focus on herself, something she had never allowed herself to do. LeBron kept in close contact with Mrs. Parker, checking in on her regularly to ensure that the retirement plan and healthcare were working smoothly. But more than anything, he simply wanted to see her enjoying the life she had worked so hard for. He would call her on occasion, and their conversations always felt warm and genuine, like catching up with an old friend. One afternoon, LeBron decided to take a break from his usual schedule and visit Mrs. Parker at her home. He knew she was adjusting to the change, but there was something about seeing her finally get to enjoy her time that made him feel like he had done the right thing. When he arrived at her small, cozy house on the outskirts of Akron, Mrs. Parker greeted him at the door with a beaming smile. Her hair, now completely gray, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was dressed in a comfortable sweater and slacks, the kind of outfit that exuded a quiet, dignified elegance. "LeBron, it's so good to see you," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Come on in. I've got some tea brewing, and I've been meaning to ask how your latest project is going." LeBron smiled as he entered, feeling a sense of relief wash over him as he took in the peaceful surroundings. Mrs. Parker had always been a calming presence in his life, but now she seemed to radiate a contentment he had never seen in her before. "I'm doing well, Mrs. Parker," he said, taking a seat at her kitchen table. "But I think the real question is, how are you? Are you getting used to all this free time?" Mrs. Parker chuckled as she sat down across from him, setting a cup of tea in front of him. "It's still a bit strange, you know. I've never really had a lot of time to myself. I've always been on the go, first with the school, then with the kids at home, and now I'm just here, with nothing to do but relax." She paused, looking down at her hands for a moment before lifting her gaze to meet his. "But I have to admit, it feels good. I didn't know what it would feel like, but I think I'm finally learning to enjoy it." LeBron nodded, his eyes softening as he watched her. He could see the peace in her expression, the joy of knowing she no longer had to work just to survive. "You deserve this, Mrs. Parker. I've been thinking a lot about everything you've done over the years. It's incredible, really." Mrs. Parker smiled gently, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I never did it for the recognition, LeBron. I just wanted to help. I've always believed that kindness, no matter how small, can make a difference. That was my goal, just to be there for the kids and make sure they knew they were seen. The rest was just part of the job." LeBron shook his head. "It was never just part of the job, Mrs. Parker. What you did for me, what you did for all of us, You were more than a lunch lady. You were a mentor, a support system. You were there when I needed someone to believe in me. I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for you." Mrs. Parker looked at him, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "LeBron, I didn't do anything special. I just did what I thought was right." LeBron reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. "It was special, Mrs. Parker. It was more than special. You gave everything to everyone else, and now I want you to have the time to do things for yourself. This is your time now. You've earned it." The room fell into a quiet, comfortable silence, the weight of the moment not lost on either of them. For LeBron, this moment was about more than just helping Mrs. Parker retire. It was about honoring the impact she had on his life and the lives of so many others. It was about giving her the chance to rest, to reflect, and to enjoy the peace she had always given others. As the afternoon passed, the two of them shared stories and laughed, just as they had done all those years ago. Mrs. Parker told him about her plans to visit her sister in Florida, something she had never been able to do when she was working. LeBron listened, genuinely happy for her, knowing that these moments of joy and relaxation were long overdue. Before LeBron left, he stood at the door, looking at Mrs. Parker one last time. "You've made a difference, Mrs. Parker. More than you'll ever know. You've impacted so many lives, including mine. I just want you to know that we'll always remember you, and we'll always be grateful." Mrs. Parker smiled, a tear in her eye. "Thank you, LeBron. You've given me something I never thought I'd have, peace of mind and the chance to enjoy my time. I'll never forget that." LeBron nodded, his heart full. "You deserve it all, Mrs. Parker. Enjoy every moment." As he left her house that afternoon, LeBron felt a deep sense of contentment. He had done something good, something meaningful, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And in return, he had given Mrs. Parker a gift far greater than money or material things. He had given her the gift of peace, of rest, and the knowledge that her kindness had shaped a generation.